Greetings. First, I'd like to apologize for not uploading as regularly as I'd like to. At the moment, IRL is really kicking my buttocks. I have a lot to do, not all of it terribly pleasant, and it's just preoccupying me, so I just don't have the time I had, say, in the summer, and I hope that changes in the not-too-distant future. Now, today's topic, though, is an important one, and it's kind of the elephant in the room, because I like Baldur's Gate 3 a lot. I've talked about the game a lot. Lots of people like Baldur's Gate 3 a lot. The game, of course, by no means is perfect, but it's an excellent game overall. But the elephant in the room I'm referring to is, to be perfectly honest, the difficulty. The game, quite simply, on Tactician, is not hard enough. Now, before we go into the nitty-gritty of difficulty and what defines difficulty, let's first talk about one of the most popular genres of BG3 and CRPG videos in general, and that is build guides and mechanics breakdown videos. And for the record, I want to endorse 3 channels, which I'm sure you know about, that I think are fantastic channels. You have Aestus RPG, who is a true master of numbers and mechanics, who does excellent work in terms of analyzing the numbers, looking at what's effective and what's not. The same, I would say, about Casual Veteran Gamer, who has something like 2,000 to 3,000 hours on Baldur's Gate 3. And finally, one of my favorite channels for builds, whether it's Baldur's Gate 3 or Pathfinder, is CRPG Bro, the Slayer of Capybaras. Fantastic channel, go check it out. But I cite this because people love build guides, and they love the breakdown of spells and mechanics. And I do too. I'm subbed to all these channels, and I check them out whenever they upload videos, and I have the time to do so. But one glaring question I have in light of all of this is that the best builds and the best mechanics guides are most relevant when it comes to the greatest challenges in terms of difficulty. Baldur's Gate 3, in and of itself, is not a hard game. Yes, there's Tactician, but Tactician is very accessible, very easy, and it feels basically like normal difficulty would in many other games. Now, many people like to compare Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous with Baldur's Gate 3, and I like to do that too on occasion. And if we think about the difficulty, this is an area where Pathfinder excels in the sense that there are many different difficulty settings, each one increasing the challenge, culminating, of course, in unfair. Unfair being literally unfair. Ridiculous stats, ridiculous dice rolls, ridiculous saves on the part of enemies. And whilst I've played on unfair on Pathfinder, my preferred difficulty is hard. Hard is still a decent challenge, but it's not supremely irritating and annoying the same way unfair is, and it offers a little bit more flexibility in terms of builds. That said, I usually like to play on the hardest difficulty available, with the exception of unfair. But comparing Baldur's Gate 3, Tactician with, say, even hard is just way above that. Because hard in Pathfinder games by Owlcat still requires planning, knowledge of the mechanics. You can by no means just wing it with hard. Still need to apply certain things and apply certain knowledge. And I think that is the critical difference. If you play Pathfinder games on normal, daring, or even core, you can kind of just wing it, although core a little less so. And unfortunately, Baldur's Gate 3 only has 3 difficulty settings. And Tactician, the hardest one, feels like a cross between normal and daring on Pathfinder, which just isn't very much of a challenge. Now here, I want to distinguish between combat fun factor versus combat challenge. And in some ways, they're interlinked and connected. In some ways, they're not. So I'll say right off the bat that Baldur's Gate 3 combat is super fun. The Larian formula of applying environmental effects, the verticality, the flexibility, it is some of the most fun combat you are going to get in an RPG. Hands down, no questions asked, that is a fact. However, the distinct lack of challenge makes it rather unrewarding. And here I'm distinguishing between fun factor, the pure mechanics involved, whether you're throwing your party members at enemies, electrifying puddles, lighting up grease puddles with fire magic, or attacking from on high. That's all really fun, but fun also has to feel rewarding. And this is a fundamental flaw, I will have to say, in the context of Baldur's Gate 3. Because part of the fun, ultimately, apart from the details of the mechanics, which in and of themselves are fun, is the fun to reward ratio. If combat is simply fun, but not a challenge, then it ceases to feel rewarding. And that is a huge issue in Baldur's Gate 3. Combat is really fun, but it's so easy that it doesn't feel rewarding. And so getting back to my earlier point about build guides and mechanics reviews and all sorts of these things, these are absolutely essential and great, and I love the content, and the content creators who make these things. The problem is, it doesn't really count because there's no difficulty level in Baldur's Gate 3 that calls for knowledge of these things. Which is to say, it might be the case that Call Lightning is a really good spell, and you can kind of notice the difference between that and a different spell, but when push comes to shove, when there's a real challenge, it turns out not to be much of a challenge, because challenge by its very nature in terms of difficulty is going to incorporate certain limitations, which is to say, some builds will be more viable than others. And I think this point is well illustrated in a game such as Pathfinder, where, if you want to play on the highest of difficulty, you need to tailor your build rather precisely to them, because if you don't, you will get crushed by the enemies. And some builds, frankly speaking, even some archetypes in their entirety, are just not viable depending on the difficulty. And that is simply part and parcel of CRPG game design. Not everything is viable, but in order to have that extra challenge and difficulty, you need to have that division between archetypes, between builds, and the challenge itself. And that's still true in the current meta with Tactician difficulty. It's just that it doesn't matter that much. Now, obviously, when I'm talking about this, I'm not dictating to people what they should play or what difficulty they should play on. And there are many people who play Baldur's Gate 3 just to enjoy the story and don't care about combat. That's great, and they should. This video is not directed towards them. But for many of us who enjoy a greater challenge, albeit not Pathfinder unfair, to be perfectly honest, in terms of enjoyment, Baldur's Gate is simply lacking in this department. And so what would be really great is to have all these mechanics guides and all these build guides as they pertain to a difficulty that gives you sufficient challenge, which then incurs that feeling of reward, coupled with the fun factor which is already there in the combat mechanics as they stand now. Now, how this would be achieved is quite difficult, because normally how you achieve difficulty is simply through stat bloat, better saves, more damage given, and less damage taken. And of course, that's to some extent a given, but I think in addition to those things, which as I said are a given, the best, most important change they could make would be fundamental changes to the AI, because then you would really have that challenge. So to review, you have combat fun factor, which Baldur's Gate 3 definitely has, but it lacks challenge, which then leads to a greater sense of reward. If Larian can add a greater difficulty, that's a legitimate challenge. It doesn't need to be the equivalent of unfair on Pathfinder. Perhaps in a definitive edition, or simply as a massive patch edition, that would be very, very welcome. Because as it stands now, the fun factor is insufficient to whet the appetites of many of us who simply want a greater challenge, which then leads to greater reward and a greater sense of satisfaction with respect to gameplay. Now, as I stated at the outset, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is an excellent game. Everything I've talked about, the criticism I offered, is meant to be constructive criticism. If you look at my content, I am far from a mindless hater. But I do think this is the missing link in the gameplay aspects of the game, and I hope that Larian seriously entertains implementing a greater challenge in terms of difficulty. In any event, thank you very much for tuning in. If you like my content, you can leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe. Really helps out the channel. And if you want, you can join my Discord, where we talk about games and RPGs, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.